This lecture accompanies Chapter 8 of your textbook, The Anatomy and Physiology of Personality. The physical basis of personality begins at a cellular level, so let's spend a minute acquainting or reacquainting ourselves with our nerve cells, also known as neurons. Dendrites are the projections on nerve cells that receive stimulation, whereas axons pass on stimulation from the nerve cell. We can also distinguish nerves by the direction that the electrochemical signals travel. For afferent nerves, messages travel along these nerves from the body to the central nervous system. Efferent nerves, messages travel along these nerves from the central nervous system to the body. We'll return to nerve functions when we talk about the biochemical processes underlying personality. Before talking about the biology of personality, it's also important to be aware of how we know what we know about the brain and personality. There have been three major approaches to studying the anatomy of personality. Brain damage, brain stimulation, and brain imaging are these three approaches. Before other research techniques were developed, naturally occurring brain damage allowed scientists to draw conclusions about personality by keeping track of specific problems caused by damage to different parts of the brain. Phineas Gage is one of the earliest, most famous examples of how injuries to the brain can cause significantly large changes in personality and behavior. In animal models, scientists also deliberately destroy a brain region so that it's cut off from other brain structures, or just remove it completely and then observe behavior, something that can't be done in humans ethically. Brain stimulation can also give us clues about the anatomy of personality. With this technique, scientists stimulate specific brain regions directly to see what happens by placing electrodes on the brain. One example is a case study in which a woman had an area deep in the middle of her brain, the substantia nigra, stimulated, and it caused an acute episode of depression. In this case study, the woman started in a pleasant mood. They stimulated the substantia nigra, and this is how she responded when she asked how she was feeling. Quote, "I'm falling down in my head. I no longer wish to live, to see anything, hear anything, feel anything," end quote. When asked if in pain, she said, quote, "No, I'm fed up with life. I've had enough. I don't want to live anymore. I'm disgusted with life. Everything is useless, always feeling worthless. I'm scared in this world," end quote. But by a little more than a minute after the stimulation ended, she was laughing. Things like this, methods like this can tell us a bit about how personality works relative to the brain regions. Transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS, is a current technique that creates virtual lesions by turning off parts of the brain to see how psychological processes are affected. It does this by using magnetic fields to temporarily knock out areas of brain activity. One study used TMS where people rated themselves and a best friend on a set of desirable and undesirable traits, while the magnetic stimulation temporarily shut off brain activity in the middle or medial prefrontal cortex. Their tendency to describe themselves in more favorable terms, in other words, to self-enhance, was lessened as a result, compared with ratings given in a control condition where the equipment was noisily activated but no actual stimulation was delivered. These intriguing findings suggest that activity in the middle front part of the brain is a necessary part of the natural tendency to describe ourselves more positively than we describe others. A third approach for examining the brain and personality is to observe the brain functions directly, in other words, viewing what the brain is doing while it's doing it. The oldest technique is EEG. Electrodes are put on the scalp and they pick up electric signals generated by the brain. A newer related technique, MEG, detects magnetic indications of brain activity. Both of these techniques are useful for determining when the brain is especially active, but they're not specific with regard to where in the brain activity is really concentrated. Integrating biology, physics, mathematics, engineering, and computing resulted in more sophisticated ways of viewing brain regions and functions. CT scans can examine small structures because they're basically x-rays of the brain that are taken of very thin slices at multiple angles. CT scans, which tell you where the brain regions are located, can be used with positron emission tomography, or PET, to actually map where brain activity is happening based on blood flow. MRIs use powerful magnetic fields and radio waves to produce images. Functional MRI doesn't just take pictures of the brain, it allows you to map brain activity based on magnetic impulses generated by oxygen in the blood. The theory is that brain signals are just movements of oxygen through the brain, which can be tracked and mapped using fancy things like map and computers and magnets. Check out the TED Talk by Sarah Blakemore if you're interested in learning how fMRI can be used to study changes in personality across adolescence and adulthood. Now we'll talk about 3 specific regions of the brain: the amygdala, the frontal lobes, and the anterior cingulate. The amygdala is located near the hippocampus in the frontal portion of the temporal lobes. It's a key part of the brain that contributes to motivation and emotions. More specifically, the amygdala links perceptions and thoughts about the world with their emotional meaning. It plays a role in all types of emotions, as well as in the appraisal of threat or reward. Activity in the amygdala has been correlated with personality traits like optimism, extroversion, and neuroticism. The neocortex forms the outer layer of the brain, and it's said to be the brain's most uniquely human part. The frontal lobes, the 2 parts of the neocortex, and the left front and right front of the brain, are particularly important for higher cognitive functions such as planning and interpreting the world. The neocortex forms the outer layer of the brain and is said to be the brain's most uniquely human part. The frontal lobes, which are the 2 parts of the neocortex, the left front and the right front of the brain, are particularly important for higher cognitive functions such as planning and interpreting the world. EEG studies show that the left frontal lobe is more active when a person wants to approach something pleasant, whereas activity in the right frontal lobe is associated with wanting to withdraw from something unpleasant and frightening. An active left brain seems to be associated with emotional stability, whereas an especially active right brain is associated with neuroticism. However, it is a little more complicated than this. There is a fascinating condition observed in cases of right frontal lobe damage called Capgras syndrome. This is where the person believes that loved ones have been replaced. They technically recognize their loved ones, but they feel nothing when they see them, so they think their loved ones are imposters. Your textbook talks more about this in detail. Finally, the anterior cingulate is another important brain area related to emotion and personality, and it inhibits the amygdala and therefore plays an important role in controlling emotional responses and behavioral impulses. There are possible implications for the functioning of the anterior cingulate and extroversion and neuroticism. Let's switch gears now and look at the biochemistry of personality. Neurochemicals and hormones are arguably more relevant to personality than particular brain regions, as they are what drive brain activity. The study of chemistry of personality goes back to Hippocrates and Galen, who theorized that personality depended upon the levels of 4 humors or fluids in the body, and that an imbalance in the 4 humors led to certain notable personality characteristics as well as certain physical characteristics. The 4 fluids are blood, black bile, yellow bile, and phlegm. Your textbook talks a little bit about this. But we now know that neurotransmitters and hormones are really what drives personality. Neurotransmitters are chemicals that travel across the synapse between neurons where they cause a chemical reaction that has an excitatory or inhibitory effect. Hormones are biological substances that affect the body in locations different from where they were produced. Although hormones and neurotransmitters have a lot of similarities, there are some key differences. Neurotransmitters belong to the nervous system, whereas hormones belong to the endocrine system. Transmission of neurotransmitters is across the synaptic cleft, whereas that of hormones is by blood. Hormones are produced by endocrine glands, while neurotransmitters are produced by neurons. Finally, the action of neurotransmitters is extremely fast. In contrast, the effect of hormones can last from a few seconds to a few days. Let's look first at the most commonly discussed neurotransmitters, serotonin and dopamine. Research by DeYoung suggests that the stability traits, emotional stability or neuroticism, agreeableness, and conscientiousness are associated with the neurotransmitter serotonin, whereas the plasticity traits, which are extroversion and openness, are associated with the neurotransmitter dopamine. More specifically, dopamine is the neurotransmitter that turns motivation into action. It plays a key role in the control of body movements, and it's associated with how we respond to reward and our tendency to approach attractive objects and people. Research shows that dopamine is part of the basis of sociability and general activity level. A severe lack of dopamine is implicated in Parkinson's disease. Dopamine has been related to bipolar disorder, extroversion, and impulsivity. The theory of individual differences in impulsivity, extroversion, and other personality traits associated with dopamine is that people to different degrees develop neurons that produce and are responsive to dopamine. Having more cells in dopaminergic regions is related to motivation to seek rewards and enjoy them, and to being especially assertive, dominant, and outgoing. Again, dopamine is related to the fundamental dimension of plasticity, which in this context means a general tendency to explore and engage with possibilities. Serotonin plays an important role in the inhibition of behavioral impulses. In other words, stopping oneself from doing something attractive yet unwise or dangerous. Prozac is a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, which means it allows more serotonin to be available for uptake. Benefits of this include avoiding excessive worrying, not being too quick to anger, and not being oversensitive. However, there can be the development of serotonin depletion syndrome, in which case someone will suffer from chronic pessimism, hypersensitivity to rejection, worrying obsessively, and being prone to sudden bursts of irrational anger. Epinephrine, also known as adrenaline, and norepinephrine create the fight or flight response. These chemicals lead to the brain being fully alert and concentrated on the threat. They are released in response to stress. There's been criticism of the fight or flight research that there's been too much of a focus on males, and that females may respond differently to stress. This has led to the theory of tend and befriend, that in response to stress, women are more likely to calm others down and get people to work together to deal with the threat. This has also led to more of an emphasis on oxytocin. Oxytocin is a hormone that plays an important role in mother-child bonding, romantic attachment, and sexual response. Greater levels of oxytocin are known to decrease fearfulness and facilitate approach behaviors. Testosterone has been studied in many investigations. The link with aggression is complex. Some studies have found that high levels of testosterone are related to aggression and behavioral control problems, criminal behaviors such as assault and drug use, as well as dominance and loneliness. But men with high testosterone are not always aggressive. Also, in some species, females are more aggressive than males, or there is no gender differences. For example, among the antelope, females are the ones who take control of the mating process, and they are the aggressors. Lionesses do the bulk of the hunting. Testosterone is also related to many other behaviors in males and females, because testosterone does not just occur in males. It's related to sociability, impulsivity, lower inhibition, less conformity, sexual interest, and desire. It can interact with personality traits to impact behavior. There is an unknown causal direction between testosterone and behavior, however, because aggression and sex can affect testosterone levels just as much as testosterone can affect aggression and sex. The hormone cortisol is released in response to stress, either physical or psychological stress, and it helps prepare the body for action. It speeds up the heart rate and stimulates muscle growth. It also alters attention thresholds and participates in the consolidation of emotional memory. Chronically high levels of cortisol are seen in people with severe stress, anxiety, and depression. It may be an effect rather than a cause. Low levels of cortisol have been seen in people with post-traumatic stress disorder, as well as antisocial personality disorder. They may be related to sensation seeking, and it might be due to an abnormal response to danger signals. In conclusion, biology's cause and effect is unknown. The relationship between the brain and its environment works in both directions. Understanding the brain can help us understand behavior, but understanding behavior can also help us understand the brain.